There's a part of Central Park you've probably walked through without thinking. It's quiet, no horse-drawn carriages nearby, no musicians playing Beatles covers for tips. Just a stretch of grass, some trees, maybe a dog running ahead of its owner. The city buzzes at the edges, but here, for a moment, it's still. You wouldn't know it's standing there, but beneath your feet, under the soil and the tree roots, there was once a village. A real one, with houses, churches, families, laughter, and loss. But no street signs mark it now. No foundations poke through the ground. No plaques, no statues, no monuments. Just silence. And that silence? It didn't happen by accident. This is the story of Seneca Village, an entire black community that New York City made disappear. Not by fire, not by war, but by something far colder. A plan. Let's go back. It's the early 1800s. New York is changing fast. Slavery has just been abolished here in 1827, but racism hasn't gone anywhere. In fact, the deeper you look, the clearer it becomes. Freedom didn't mean safety. It didn't mean dignity. And it certainly didn't mean equality. In Lower Manhattan, black families live crammed into dirty tenements, often targeted by police and harassed by mobs. There are riots in the streets, driven by fear and hate. White workers blame free black citizens for taking jobs. Landlords hike rents, knowing most have nowhere else to go. Churches are burned. Schools are segregated. And hope, that's a luxury not many can afford. But a few miles north, far from the smoke and spit of the city's core, something unusual begins to take shape. In 1825, a white couple named John and Elizabeth White sold 3 plots of land near what is now 82nd Street to a black man named Andrew Williams. He was 25 years old, a shoe shiner, and he paid $125 for the land. It wasn't a gift. It wasn't charity. It was a transaction, one that made him a property owner. That was important, critically important, because at the time, New York law said black men could only vote if they owned property worth at least $250. It wasn't a law for safety. It was a law for suppression, a way to keep power concentrated in the hands of the white and wealthy. But that didn't stop them. More black families began purchasing land in the area. Some came for the chance to vote. Others came for peace. Others came because it was the only place where they were allowed to build. And so Seneca Village was born, not overnight, not by proclamation, but slowly, like roots creeping through stubborn soil. By the 1830s, this small village had a name. It had a school. It had churches. It had families, black, Irish, German all, living in modest homes with vegetable gardens and wells, far from the chaos of Lower Manhattan. To the outside world, it was invisible, or worse, intentionally ignored. But for the people who lived there, it was a sanctuary. Not perfect, not wealthy, but a place to breathe. A place to be black and free at the same time, which was rare in America, rarer than most people today understand. By the early 1850s, over 225 people lived in Seneca Village. At least 30 black families owned property. And they weren't just surviving, they were doing something even more radical. They were thriving. And yet, if you picked up a New York newspaper around that time, you'd see something very different. You'd see words like squatters, vagrants, shantytown. The homes they built were called huts. The families were described as dirty and dangerous, even though many were landowners who paid taxes and attended church every Sunday. The press was building a story. And like most dangerous stories, it wasn't based on fact. It was based on what made the city more comfortable to believe. Because if this village was real, if it was legitimate, if black Americans could own land, raise families, educate their children, and build a self-sufficient community, then the city's myths began to crack. And for the powerful, nothing is more dangerous than a crack in the myth. Now let's talk about location. Seneca Village sat on some of the highest ground in Manhattan. Clean air, open space, a gentle elevation that offered cool breezes and no threat of flooding. To its residents, it was home. But to the city's elite, it was something else entirely. Opportunity. An idea had begun circulating in those circles, an idea borrowed from Europe. Wealthy Americans were calling for a grand landscaped park in the center of Manhattan. A park to rival London's Hyde Park, a place where respectable citizens could walk, rest, and enjoy nature without the grime of the city. Central Park, but where to put it? The answer came quickly, right through the homes of Seneca Village. And just like that, a clock began ticking. The villagers didn't know it yet, but their days were numbered. Not because of anything they did, but because of where they dared to exist. A black community, in plain sight, on valuable land. It couldn't be allowed to stand. By 1853, the decision was made. New York City would build a grand public park, a place to impress the world, a place where wealthy families could ride in carriages, take in fresh air, and escape the growing noise of the city. They called it progress, culture, civilization. There was just one problem. More than 1,600 people already lived on the land the city wanted, including the 200-plus residents of Seneca Village. They didn't count, or at least, that's how the city made it seem. They didn't mention the names of the people who'd lived there for decades. They didn't acknowledge the gardens, the wells, the churches, the school. Instead, officials described the land as mostly empty or neglected. The press helped push the story. They ran articles calling the area a swamp. They said the residents were nuisances, squatters, undesirable elements. None of it was true. But the truth didn't matter. The city invoked something called eminent domain law that allows the government to take private land if it is for public use, as long as they pay the owners a fair amount. Sounds simple on paper, but in reality, it's often a way to push poor people out of the way quietly, legally, permanently. The residents of Seneca Village were told their land would be taken. Some fought back. They went to court. They argued their homes had value, that they had legal deeds, that their community mattered. But the outcome was already written. Most families were offered far less money than their land was worth. Some were given no real choice. Take the money, or be removed by force. And so, slowly, piece by piece, Seneca Village began to disappear. It didn't burn. It wasn't destroyed in a single day. There were no dramatic headlines, no military raids. It happened the way so many erasures happen in America. Quietly, legally, completely. By 1857, the final families were pushed out. Their homes were demolished, the schoolhouse torn down, the church bells silenced, and then the park was built. Central Park, the pride of the city, a masterpiece of design and planning. Trees imported from around the world, lakes and winding paths, grand arches and bridges, all meant to look natural, but every curve, every hill was carefully planned. What wasn't planned was the memory of what came before. For over 150 years, the story of Seneca Village was missing from the history books. There were no signs to mark where the homes once stood, no records of what happened to the families who were forced out. It was as if the village had never existed, but it did. And not just as an idea, as a place, as a home. We know this now because archaeologists and historians have spent the last few decades digging literally and figuratively through city records, maps, even soil. They've found pieces of dishes, tools, a shoe, a child's comb. Real things that belonged to real people. People who lived, who laughed, who built something, and then lost it all. Because someone more powerful wanted the land they stood on. And maybe that's the quiet lesson hiding beneath the trees of Central Park, that even the most peaceful place can be built on silence. That beauty, when built on erasure, carries a weight it can't always hide. And that every time you walk through those green fields, you re-walking over the bones of a village that wasn't supposed to be, and was never supposed to be remembered. But now you know. For a long time, no one talked about Seneca Village. It wasn't taught in schools. It wasn't mentioned on the tours of Central Park. Even most New Yorkers people who walked through the park every week had no idea a community had ever lived there. It was a blank spot in the city's memory. And maybe that's how it was meant to be. Because forgetting is easier than remembering what was taken. It's easier to see a lake than to see a family's kitchen beneath it. But history has a way of fighting its way back. In the 1990s, a group of historians and researchers began digging into old maps and property records. They found Maine's real people who had once owned land in the park. Families like the Williamses, the Wilsons, the Amezes. Men who had the right to vote because of the land they bought. Women who had taught school in a one-room classroom that no longer stood. They also found lies documents where the city undervalued homes, minimized what the residents had built, and pushed through their removal without proper compensation. In 2011, archaeologists were finally allowed to dig beneath the surface of Central Park, at the spot where Seneca Village once stood. They didn't find grand monuments or gold. They found something much more human, a child's leather shoe, fragments of pottery and teacups, an iron kettle used for cooking, a small bone handle from a toothbrush, tiny, quiet things. But when put together, they tell a story louder than any newspaper ever could. They tell us this was a home, that people laughed here, cooked here, sang in churches, learned to read, grew old, raised children, made plans for the future. They didn't just live here, they belonged here. And that makes what happened not just sad, but cruel. Because Seneca Village wasn't lost by time. It wasn't ruined by war or abandoned in the night. It was taken, deliberately, systematically, covered up with soil, grass, and carefully designed silence. Even today, there is no full apology from the city, no major memorial, just a few signs tucked away in the park. You have to go looking for them. Most people walk right past, but now the story is being told, in classrooms, in books, in documentaries, in voices like yours and mine. And the more people who know, the less invisible Seneca Village becomes. Still, there are questions we're left with, questions no park map can answer. What happens when a home is taken, but never given back? What does it mean for a city to erase a place and then plant flowers on top? And who gets remembered, who gets written into the pages of history, and who gets buried underneath? Maybe we can't bring Seneca Village back, but we can bring back the truth. And that's something worth walking through the park for. Because sometimes the most powerful stories aren't in museums or movies. They're buried in the ground, just waiting for someone to ask what used to be here. And now you know what did.